Minji Park met Sebastian Weber at an international business conference in Seoul during the spring of 2018. She was 28, working as a translator for a pharmaceutical company, fluent in Korean, English, and conversational German. Sebastian, 34, was a senior procurement manager for a Munich-based medical equipment firm. He was charming, well-dressed, and spoke about Germany with such warmth that Minji found herself captivated by his descriptions of Christmas markets, alpine villages, and a culture that valued precision and order. Their courtship was swift but intense. Sebastian visited Seoul 3 more times over the following months, each visit filled with romantic dinners, thoughtful gifts, and long conversations about their future together. He met Minji's family during his 3rd visit, presenting himself as a respectful suitor who admired Korean culture and wanted to learn more about it. Minji's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Park, were impressed by his professional success and apparent devotion to their daughter. Her older sister, Hye-jin, was more cautious, noting something she could not quite articulate about the way Sebastian's smile never quite reached his eyes. By December 2018, Minji and Sebastian were married in a small ceremony in Seoul, followed by a larger celebration in Munich, where Minji met Sebastian's family and friends. The adjustment to life in Germany was challenging. Minji's German was functional but not fluent, and she found herself isolated in their apartment in the Schwabing district, while Sebastian worked long hours. She enrolled in advanced German classes and began looking for translation work. But Sebastian discouraged her from accepting positions that required evening hours or travel. He explained that he wanted her to be available when he came home, that a strong marriage required her presence and attention. Minji tried to maintain her connection to her family in Seoul through daily video calls with her mother and sister. Hye-jin, who worked as a pediatric nurse, would share stories about her patients and ask detailed questions about Minji's life in Munich. During these calls, Minji carefully curated what she shared, omitting Sebastian's growing insistence that she ask his permission before making plans, his complaints when she spoke Korean too loudly on the phone, or his habit of checking her messages and emails without asking. In August 2019, Hye-jin was diagnosed with an aggressive form of brain cancer. The news devastated the Park family. Minji immediately wanted to fly to Seoul, but Sebastian convinced her to wait until Hye-jin's treatment plan was established. He argued that rushing over in a panic would not help anyone, and that Minji needed to be rational about travel expenses and his work commitments. Minji reluctantly agreed, speaking to her sister every day as Hye-jin underwent surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments that left her weak and frightened. By January 2020, it became clear that the treatments were not working. Hye-jin's condition deteriorated rapidly. Sebastian finally agreed that Minji could travel to Seoul, booking her a ticket for early February. But Hye-jin died on January 28th, 3 days before Minji's scheduled departure. Minji collapsed when she received the call from her mother. Sebastian held her as she sobbed, stroking her hair and murmuring that everything would be all right, that death was a natural part of life, that Hye-jin was no longer suffering. The funeral arrangements were made quickly according to Korean Buddhist traditions. Sebastian accompanied Minji to Seoul, and they arrived the day before the funeral service. At the funeral home, Minji stood before her sister's open casket, overwhelmed by grief. Hye-jin looked peaceful, dressed in a traditional hanbok, her hands folded across her chest. Minji wanted to touch her sister's face one final time to say goodbye properly, but Sebastian's hand on her shoulder felt heavy, controlling. He whispered that they should not linger, that her parents needed her support more than Hye-jin did now. Minji felt something shift inside her at those words, a cold recognition that perhaps Hye-jin had been right to be cautious about Sebastian from the beginning. The evening after the funeral viewing, the Park family gathered at their home in the Gangnam district, a modest apartment filled with photographs of Hye-jin throughout her life. Neighbors and relatives came to pay respects, bringing food and condolences. Min-ji moved through the gathering in a daze, accepting embraces and murmured sympathies, while Sebastian remained near the entrance, observing everything with an expression that Min-ji's mother later described as clinical detachment. Korean funeral traditions typically involve a 3-day mourning period, but the family had condensed the schedule due to Sebastian's insistence that he could not be away from work for an extended time. The burial was planned for the following afternoon at a cemetery in Yongin, about an hour outside Seoul. Min-ji's father had made all the arrangements with the funeral director, selecting a plot near where his own parents were buried. As the evening grew late and guests departed, Sebastian suggested to Min-ji that they return to their hotel. Min-ji refused, explaining that she wanted to stay with her parents through the night, as was customary. Sebastian's jaw tightened, but he nodded and said he would return to the hotel alone. Before leaving, he pulled Min-ji aside into the small kitchen and spoke quietly in German, telling her that she was allowing her grief to make her forget her responsibilities to him. Min-ji stared at him, shocked by his selfishness at such a moment, but she was too exhausted to argue. She simply turned away and rejoined her mother in the living room. Around midnight, after Min-ji's parents had finally gone to bed, Min-ji sat alone with Hye-jin's photograph, taken just 2 years earlier during a trip to Jeju Island. Hye-jin was laughing in the picture, her hair wind-blown, her smile genuine and bright. Min-ji wondered what her sister would tell her to do about Sebastian, whether Hye-jin would encourage her to leave him or to try harder to make the marriage work. But Hye-jin was gone, and Min-ji felt more alone than she ever had in her life. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sebastian. He wrote that he could not sleep and asked her to meet him at the funeral home. He claimed he wanted to pay private respects to Hye-jin, that he felt guilty for not having known her better. Min-ji hesitated, but guilt and obligation propelled her to agree. She left a note for her parents and took a taxi to the funeral home, arriving shortly after 1 in the morning. Sebastian was waiting outside, smoking a cigarette despite having claimed years ago that he had quit. He greeted Min-ji with a kiss on the forehead and explained that he had arranged with the funeral director's night attendant to allow them a few minutes alone in the viewing room. Min-ji felt uneasy, but followed him inside. The building was silent and dimly lit, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. In the viewing room, Hye-jin's casket remained open. Sebastian approached it slowly, and Min-ji stood beside him. He studied Hye-jin's face for a long moment, then turned to Min-ji and said something that made her blood run cold. He told her that in Germany there was an old tradition, rarely practiced anymore, where family members would lie beside their deceased loved ones as a final goodbye, to literally feel close to them one last time. He said he thought it might bring Min-ji closure. Min-ji stepped back, disturbed by the suggestion. She told Sebastian that this was not a Korean custom, that it felt wrong and disrespectful. Sebastian's expression hardened. He reminded her that she was his wife, that he had traveled all this way to support her, that the least she could do was trust his judgment about what might help her grief. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it that Min-ji had learned to recognize as dangerous. Before Min-ji could protest further, Sebastian placed his hands on her shoulders and guided her toward the casket. He spoke softly, almost hypnotically, telling her that it would only be for a moment, that no one would ever know, that she would regret it forever if she did not take this chance to be close to her sister one final time. Min-ji found herself standing at the edge of the casket, looking down at Hye-jin's peaceful face. Her mind felt foggy, caught between exhaustion, grief, and Sebastian's insistent pressure. He continued speaking in that low, soothing tone, telling her that this moment was sacred, that she should not let fear prevent her from saying a proper goodbye. His hands remained on her shoulders, firm but not forceful, guiding rather than pushing. Against every instinct screaming inside her, Minji allowed Sebastian to help her climb into the casket beside her sister. The space was narrow, barely wide enough for Yejin's body alone. Minji had to turn on her side, pressing against the silk lining, her face inches from Yejin's cold cheek. The smell of formaldehyde and flowers was overwhelming. Minji's heart pounded as Sebastian arranged her position, adjusting her arms and legs as though she were a doll. He told her to close her eyes and remember the good times with Yejin, their childhood in Seoul, the secrets they had shared, the bond between sisters that death could not truly break. Minji squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face, wanting desperately to believe that this bizarre ritual had some meaning, some value. But all she felt was horror and a deep, nauseating wrongness. Sebastian produced his phone, and Minji heard the distinct click of a camera shutter. Her eyes flew open, and she saw him photographing her in the casket with Yejin. She tried to sit up, panic flooding through her, but Sebastian's hand pressed gently on her shoulder, keeping her in place. He explained calmly that he was documenting this moment for her, that someday she would want to remember this final closeness with her sister. His voice remained steady, reasonable, as though what he was doing was completely normal. Minji began to cry harder, her body shaking. She begged Sebastian to let her out, telling him she wanted to leave immediately. He helped her climb out of the casket, supporting her as her legs trembled. Once she was standing, Sebastian embraced her, whispering that he was proud of her courage, that what she had just done proved how deeply she loved her sister. Minji felt sick and confused, unable to process what had just happened or why she had allowed it. They left the funeral home quickly. In the taxi back to her parents' apartment, Sebastian held Minji's hand and told her that what they had shared in that room was private and special, that her parents would not understand if she told them, that it would only cause them unnecessary pain. Minji nodded numbly, staring out the window at the Seoul streets passing by in the darkness. When they arrived at the apartment, Sebastian kissed her goodnight and returned to his hotel. Minji entered quietly, finding her parents still asleep. She went to the bathroom and vomited, then sat on the cold tile floor, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked at her phone and saw that Sebastian had texted her. The message contained one of the photographs he had taken, showing Minji lying in the casket beside Yejin. Beneath the photo, he had written, "You looked so peaceful together. I love you." Minji deleted the message immediately, her hands shaking. She wanted to delete the photo from Sebastian's phone as well, but she had no way to do so. She realized with growing dread that he now possessed evidence of something that looked deeply disturbing, something that could be misinterpreted or weaponized against her. She understood that this was intentional, that Sebastian had engineered the entire situation to create leverage over her. The next morning, Minji went through the motions of the burial ceremony. She stood beside her parents at the graveside, as Hyejin's casket was lowered into the ground. Sebastian stood slightly apart from the family, his expression appropriately somber. When the ceremony concluded and people offered their final condolences, Minji's mother pulled her aside and asked if she was all right. Mrs. Park said that Minji looked ill, that perhaps she should see a doctor before flying back to Germany. Minji assured her mother that she was simply grieving, that she would be fine once she had time to rest. Minji and Sebastian returned to Munich 3 days after the burial. During the flight, Sebastian was attentive and affectionate, ordering Minji's favorite meals, covering her with a blanket when she dozed, holding her hand during turbulence. To any observer, they appeared to be a devoted couple, supporting each other through grief. But Minji felt hollow inside, mechanically accepting his gestures while her mind replayed the scene in the funeral home over and over. Their apartment in Schwabing felt different when they arrived. Minji noticed details she had previously overlooked. The way Sebastian had positioned furniture to give him clear sight lines to every room, the absence of any photographs of her family on display, the single set of keys that Sebastian kept on his person at all times. She had been living in a carefully constructed cage without fully realizing it. In the weeks following their return, Sebastian's behavior shifted in subtle but disturbing ways. He began mentioning the photographs from the funeral home during arguments, never directly threatening to share them, but implying their existence. When Minji expressed interest in visiting her parents during the summer, Sebastian reminded her that she had engaged in behavior at the funeral home that her conservative parents would find shocking and inappropriate. He suggested that perhaps she was not thinking clearly, that grief had compromised her judgment. Minji contacted a grief counselor through her German language school, hoping to process the trauma of losing Hyejin and the growing fear she felt in her marriage. She attended 3 sessions before Sebastian discovered the appointments on their shared calendar. He was furious, accusing her of discussing their private life with strangers, of betraying his trust. He demanded to know everything she had told the counselor. Minji lied, saying she had only talked about missing her sister, nothing about their relationship. Sebastian studied her face for a long moment before nodding and saying he believed her, but that she should stop the sessions because they were making her more depressed rather than helping. The isolation intensified. Sebastian began working from home more frequently, setting up a desk in the living room where he could monitor Minji's activities. He suggested she stop attending her German classes, arguing that she was already fluent enough and that the time would be better spent improving her cooking or learning to do proper housekeeping. When Minji protested that she enjoyed the classes and the social interaction, Sebastian's expression darkened. He reminded her that he was the one working and providing for them, that the least she could do was respect his preferences about how their household should function. Minji's phone calls with her mother became less frequent and more strained. Mrs. Park sensed something was wrong, but Minji could not find the words to explain her situation. How could she tell her mother that she was afraid of her own husband, that he had photographs of her lying in a casket with Hyejin, that she felt trapped in a foreign country with no money of her own, no job, and no clear way to escape? Her mother would be horrified and heartbroken, and Minji could not bear to add to her grief. By May 2020, Munich was under lockdown due to the COVID pandemic. Sebastian expressed satisfaction with the restrictions, noting that now Minji would have no excuse to leave the apartment at all. They were confined together in the space that had become Minji's prison. Sebastian established new rules. Minji was to have meals ready at specific times, keep the apartment spotless, and be available whenever he wanted her attention or affection. He began reviewing her phone each evening, reading her messages and browsing history. During one of these inspections, Sebastian found that Minji had been researching domestic violence resources and Korean embassy contact information. His reaction was terrifyingly calm. He sat her down at the kitchen table and explained that he understood she was struggling with her mental health, that losing Hyejin had clearly been more traumatic than either of them had anticipated. He suggested that perhaps she needed medication, that he would arrange for her to see a psychiatrist who could prescribe something to help with her paranoia and depression. Sebastian scheduled an appointment with Dr. Klaus Hartmann, a psychiatrist who maintained a private practice in the Maxvorstadt district. He accompanied Minji to the initial consultation, insisting that his presence was necessary to provide important context about her behavior and mental state. Dr. Hartmann, a man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a clinical demeanor, listened as Sebastian described Minji's symptoms: depression following her sister's death, paranoid thoughts about their relationship, obsessive internet searching about leaving Germany, and what he characterized as increasing irrationality. Minji sat silently during Sebastian's monologue, her hands folded in her lap. When Dr. Hartmann finally addressed her directly, asking how she would describe her emotional state, Minji glanced at Sebastian before speaking. She said she missed her sister and felt homesick for Korea, that adjusting to life in Munich had been more difficult than she anticipated. Dr. Hartmann asked if she felt safe in her marriage. Minji's throat tightened and she nodded, yes, aware of Sebastian's eyes on her. The psychiatrist prescribed an antidepressant and scheduled a follow-up appointment for 4 weeks later. Sebastian filled the prescription immediately and began supervising Minji's medication intake each morning and evening. Within days, Minji felt foggy and disconnected, moving through each day in a chemical haze. She slept more than usual, sometimes 12 or 14 hours at a stretch. Sebastian seemed pleased with this development, commenting that the medication was clearly helping her rest and recover. In June, Minji's mother called with concerning news. Mr. Park had suffered a minor stroke and was hospitalized in Seoul. Mrs. Park was overwhelmed, caring for her husband while still grieving for Hyejin. She asked if Minji could possibly visit, even briefly, to help with medical decisions and provide emotional support. Minji desperately wanted to go, but when she approached Sebastian about booking a flight, he refused. He argued that travel during the pandemic was irresponsible and dangerous, that Minji's mental health was too fragile for the stress of international travel, and that her father would recover just fine without her presence. Minji begged, something she had never done before. She got on her knees in their living room and pleaded with Sebastian to let her see her father, promising she would return quickly, that she would do anything he asked if he would just allow her this one thing. Sebastian looked down at her with an expression of mild disgust. He told her to stand up and stop being hysterical, that her behavior proved she was not thinking rationally. He suggested increasing her medication dosage. That night, while Sebastian slept, Minji sat in the bathroom with a pair of scissors she had hidden in a toiletry bag. She considered cutting her wrists, ending the nightmare permanently. She pressed the blade against her skin, watching a thin line of blood appear. But she thought of her mother, already devastated by Hyejin's death and her husband's stroke. She could not add her own death to that burden. Minji cleaned the small wound, returned the scissors to their hiding place, and went back to bed. By August, Mr. Park had recovered enough to return home, though he required ongoing physical therapy. Minji's mother stopped asking when Minji would visit, perhaps sensing that something was preventing her daughter from traveling. Their phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Minji could hear the confusion and hurt in her mother's voice, the unasked questions about why Minji seemed so distant and unavailable. Sebastian announced in early September that his company was sending him to a 3-day conference in Frankfurt. He informed Minji that she would accompany him, that the change of scenery would be good for her mental health. Minji felt a flicker of hope, thinking that perhaps in Frankfurt she could find a way to contact the Korean embassy or reach out to resources for domestic violence victims. But Sebastian quickly extinguished that hope by explaining that he had arranged for her to stay in the hotel room during the conference sessions, that she was not to leave or interact with anyone. The Frankfurt trip took place during the 3rd week of September 2020. Sebastian checked them into a business hotel near the Messe Frankfurt Convention Center. Their room was on the 8th floor, with a window overlooking the parking structure. Sebastian reminded Minji of the rules before leaving for the first conference session. Remain in the room, do not answer the door for anyone, keep her phone on, and respond immediately to his messages. He would return during lunch to check on her. Minji waited until she heard the elevator doors close before moving to the room's small desk. She found hotel stationery and began writing a letter to her mother, explaining everything that had happened since the funeral, The photographs Sebastian had taken, the control and isolation, the medication she was being forced to take. She wrote that she loved her parents and was sorry for being distant, that she had been trying to protect them from worry, but had instead trapped herself in an impossible situation. She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressing it to her parents' apartment in Seoul. At 11:30, Minji heard the keycard in the door. Sebastian returned early, catching her standing near the desk with the letter in her hand. His eyes moved from her face to the envelope, and his expression shifted into something Minji had never seen before. Not anger, but a cold calculation that terrified her more than rage would have. Sebastian asked calmly what she was doing. Minji's mind raced, searching for a plausible lie, but exhaustion and medication made her thoughts slow and heavy. She told him the truth, that she had written to her parents, that she needed help, that she wanted to leave Germany and return to Korea. Sebastian listened without interruption, then held out his hand for the letter. Minji clutched it against her chest, shaking her head. What happened next occurred very quickly. Sebastian moved toward her and Minji backed away, still holding the letter. Her shoulders hit the window and she felt the cool glass against her back. Sebastian reached for the envelope and Minji turned away from him, pressing the letter against the window as though the glass could somehow protect it. Sebastian's hand closed around her wrist, pulling her arm back. Minji lost her balance, her hips striking the window ledge. She felt Sebastian's other hand on her shoulder, felt the pressure of his body against hers. And then, the sensation of falling backward as the window, which had not been properly latched, swung open. The hotel security footage would later show Sebastian standing at the open window for 17 seconds before stepping back and picking up the telephone to call the front desk. He reported that his wife had jumped, that she had been struggling with depression since her sister's death, that he had tried to stop her but had been too late. The footage showed him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, waiting for the authorities to arrive. Minji Park died on impact in the parking structure below. She was 30 years old. German police investigators found the letter to her parents on the floor near the window. Though the envelope was torn and the contents partially illegible from having been stepped on, what could be read suggested a woman in severe psychological distress. Sebastian's statement to police was consistent and detailed. His wife had been receiving psychiatric treatment, was on antidepressant medication, had expressed suicidal thoughts before, and had become agitated during their trip to Frankfurt. The case was preliminarily ruled a suicide. Minji's body was prepared for repatriation to South Korea for burial, her belongings packed and shipped separately. Among those belongings, forensic technicians catalogued Sebastian's laptop and phone, standard procedure even in apparent suicide cases. The devices were examined briefly, but not forensically analyzed, as there was no immediate suspicion of foul play. Minji's parents received their daughter's body at Incheon International Airport on October 2, 2020. Sebastian did not accompany the body, citing work obligations and the trauma of having witnessed his wife's death. Mrs. Park stood at the airport cargo facility, looking at the sealed casket, remembering another casket just months earlier. Mr. Park, still recovering from his stroke, leaned heavily on his cane, his face grey with grief. The funeral was held at the same funeral home where Hyejin had been mourned. As Mrs. Park prepared her daughter's body for the viewing, she noticed bruising on Minji's wrists that seemed inconsistent with a fall, finger-shaped marks that suggested someone had gripped her arms forcefully. She mentioned this to the funeral director, who suggested the marks could have occurred during the fall or from post-mortem handling. But Mrs. Park could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that her daughter's death was not what it appeared to be. She called the Munich police department, struggling through the language barrier, asking questions about the investigation. She was told through a translator that the case was closed, that her daughter had taken her own life while suffering from severe depression. Mrs. Park asked about the bruises, about whether anyone had examined Minji's body for signs of struggle. The officer assured her that standard procedures had been followed, but that if the family had concerns, they could request a more thorough investigation through official diplomatic channels. Mrs. Park sat in the same living room where she had mourned Hyejin, holding a photograph of her two daughters taken years ago when they were children, smiling and whole and alive. She thought about the last conversation she had with Minji, the distance in her daughter's voice, the fear she had sensed but not understood. She wondered if she had failed both her daughters somehow, if there were signs she should have seen and acted upon. In Munich, Sebastian Weber cleared out the apartment he had shared with Minji, donating most of her belongings to charity. He kept only a few items: her passport, some photographs, and his laptop containing the images from the funeral home in Seoul. Within 3 months, he had begun dating a young woman from Thailand who worked as a nurse at a Munich hospital. She was kind and trusting, new to Germany, and spoke limited German. Sebastian told her she reminded him of his late wife, that he thought they could build a beautiful life together.